So I couldn't help but notice that you've clicked on and are presently listening to an episode of Paranormal Patio. That's great. Thanks a lot for listening. We appreciate your support. And if you want to keep listening, you can find a whole bunch of other episodes on Spotify and wherever else you can get podcast episodes from, except for Apple. It's a personal decision. You can also find everything that you need to know about the show on paranormalpatio.com. We're on social media pretty much everywhere, I think. Just search for Paranormal Patio, and if we're on there, you'll find it. Also, we do have a Patreon, so head on over to patreon.com/beyondthepatio. You can get early access to episodes, tons of bonus content, monthly live streams, all kinds of good stuff. Thanks for listening, and we hope to have you back for the next one and all the other ones. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Paranormal Patio. As always, I'm Jason, joined again, yes, once again, by my good friend Adam Towla. Adam, how are you doing tonight, buddy?
Well, hey there. I'm doing just so great. So excited for Halloween, my favorite time of year.
Yes, and I'm excited for Hair Raising Horror Week. Tonight, Stan Gordon is going to join us to talk about Bigfoot, UFOs, and Thunderbirds.
I've never heard of these Thunderbirds, but it sounds pretty cool.
Imagine the biggest bird that you've never seen, flying through the air, being worshipped by Native Americans as possibly being the origin of life on Earth. And
wow.
In present day, well, several years ago, even swooping down from the skies and picking children up off of their Illinois lawns.
Why is it gotta be in Illinois? But do they make a sound of thunder when they're doing it?
You know, probably the beating of the flapping of the wings, sending a reverberation through the air.
Ooh. Well, now I definitely have to listen to this one. That sounds very, very terrifying.
Speaking of terrifying, you know, the Halloween season can be stressful and terrifying for everybody. And I once again have a life pro tip for you.
Can't wait.
A lot of people struggle with planting gardens. And if you plant a garden, you may plant some pumpkins, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a totally normal thing to do. Well, a lot of people struggle to get the pumpkins to actually fruit and produce, good Halloween pumpkins. So here's what you do. You feed your dog pumpkin seeds, and you will effectively and efficiently grow pumpkins because they'll come out and they'll be fertilized into your yard, and you'll have pumpkins everywhere.
But Jason, what if you don't have a dog?
Damn, I didn't think that one through.
I like where you're going with this. I think it's a very possible thing. Someone with a dog, send in your photos.
Oh no, don't do that.
Next fall.
Don't do that.
Don't send in your photos, for the love of God. I'll just go to Michael's and buy my own pumpkins that are
that's probably better.
Reusable after year.
I'm Krista Coburn from Haunted Mitten, and you're listening to Hair Raising Horror Week.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm AJ. And you're listening to Paranormal Patio's Hair Raising Horror Week.
I'm Josh Van Hook, and you're listening to Hair Raising Horror Week.
I'm Geraldine Stitt, and you're listening to Hair Raising Horror Week.
Hi, this is Jill Shelley, owner of the Haunted Boyd House, and you're listening to Hair Raising Horror Week.
I'm Tobias Wayland, and you're listening to Hair Raising Horror Week.
I'm Stan Gordon, UFO researcher and author, and you're listening to Hair Raising Horror Week.
This is Bill Konkoleski, author of Experiencer Raised in Two Worlds and Experiencer 2, Two Worlds Collide. You're listening to Hair Raising Horror Week.
Welcome back to Paranormal Patio. As always, I'm Jason, joined tonight for Hair Raising Horror Week by Stan Gordon. And I'm very excited for this. I'm a big fan of Stan's, and I cannot wait to get into this episode. Stan, welcome to the Paranormal Patio.
Jason, thanks for having me on your program.
It is my pleasure. I assure you, I am super pumped. I first learned about you through the Small Town Monsters documentary, The Invasion of Chestnut Ridge. And it's a wonderful documentary, one of my favorites. Yeah, you stood out to me because your stories are so great. Yeah, I became a fan from that point on, and I love your stuff. You have quite a rich history of different experiences and investigations, so I'm really pumped to talk to you about those. Specifically tonight, I wanted to focus on Thunderbirds. I am absolutely 100% ready to get into the other stuff too if we have time.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I deal with all kind of phenomena, and I've been doing this here 62 years of research, and actually I've never seen a UFO or a Bigfoot or a Thunderbird, but I've interviewed thousands of witnesses who have seen all types of various anomalies. I get reports all the time, as recent as yesterday and today, and it's been very active around here, and so we can discuss whatever topic you like.
I am ready. I'm so ready. So before we really get into it, I know you just kind of said you've got 62 years of research, but could you just let fans of my show who may not be familiar with you know a little bit more about yourself, how you got started into all of this?
Sure. I started this, believe it or not, when I was 10 years old in 1959 as a young kid. That I was one of those kids who was out there gathering insects, looking under my microscope and playing with my chemistry set, and I was interested in electronics, and I had received a radio as a gift in around Halloween season, and I was tuning around a radio dial one night, and there was a radio show talking about unusual occurrences. They're talking about haunted houses and flying saucers and strange creatures, and I was a curious kid, and I wanted to know if these stories were true or not, so I began to make frequent trips to a local library and started reading all the books they had on the subject, started cutting articles out of the newspaper, making scrapbooks. I was 16 years old when the incident happened near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, and I began to go out into the field to investigate UFOs and all kind of phenomena after that happened. And I've been doing that ever since. And 1969, I set up a hotline for the public to report UFO sightings. And as word was getting out, the phone in my home was ringing day and night with calls about not only UFOs, but anything strange and unusual, from Bigfoot to footprints to haunted houses, and you name it, the calls were coming in. And it became apparent very quickly that this was a lot more than I could do on my own. So I decided I was going to try to organize a research group. So in 1970, I founded the first of 3 volunteer research groups that for years would investigate sightings across Pennsylvania. And the first group was called the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group, and it was started in the Pittsburgh area. And the group was quite interesting because most of the people involved were specialists. So we had scientists, engineers, technicians, police officers, former military personnel, all kind of reputable people, men and women who volunteered their time. We all had full-time jobs, but we responded to cases quickly, and I set up the group so we could respond to cases 24 hours a day. And by 1973, we had extended to cover the whole state of Pennsylvania. And we were very busy, and we were beginning to find that we were getting referrals from the news media, from law enforcement across the state. So it was just amazing what was going on. And that led up to that massive wave in 1973, which we can talk about, when some very strange things began to come to our attention, especially with Bigfoot. There were things coming in that I sure never expected to get involved with. And there was a lot of fascinating cases, and many have happened since, that suggest that what we found out about Bigfoot indicates that we're dealing with something that's much stranger than an unknown animal. And in fact, there's indication that maybe not a normal flesh and blood animal, it's something much stranger. And if we have time, we can talk about that tonight as well. So I've been, since 1993, November of 93, I believe it was, I've been involved as an independent researcher. I don't have my groups anymore, but I have contact with many other people in the field, and I continue to receive many, many reports on my hotline, which never stops ringing, and email reports. And so there's been a lot of activity here in Pennsylvania the last few years and the last year. So we have Bigfoot sightings, cryptid sightings, UFO reports, all kind of things going on. It's very, very active.
That is wonderful. There's something about that time period, in the late 60s, early 70s that I feel like I really missed out on. And, I wasn't even born until 1985, for crying out loud. So, in my lifetime, we haven't had any of those massive waves that just kind of overtook the entire country. And even the world. And I really wish I could have been a part of that. So I'm envious.
Well, it was an interesting journey. I got involved with multitudes of cases, and there's so much. We could spend hours tonight just talking about one category, just UFOs, for example. Even though we get a lot of high altitude lights in the sky, over the years, I investigated many, many low-level, very close-range incidents involving large structured objects. And some of these cases are just amazing and fascinating. These are the kind of reports that the new government, the UAP task force, should be investigating, not just the military reports, but there are so many even ongoing cases going on that are occurring in populated areas. And this is something a lot of people are just not aware of.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And although I think the stigma of it is lessening year by year, a lot of people still aren't comfortable talking about it publicly, and they're afraid of the backlash that they might get. And luckily, there are people like you that, people can call and say, hey, this is what I saw. Please tell me I'm not crazy, and I think it goes a long way with the interconnectedness that we have in society today that, people aren't so ashamed of seeing something that they can't explain. Do you feel like, although maybe I'm wrong, maybe the reports aren't less, do you feel like the reports are less, numerous now than they were back in, the early 70s? Or are we just hearing less of it because it's less extraordinary?
Oh, no, I deal with multitudes of cases every year. Reports come in here all year round and all type of weather conditions, daylight sightings, nighttime reports. And I deal with the public right through the last few days. I have calls come in, and you're right. Even though today more and more people are more willing to talk about some of their experiences, majority of these people still want no publicity. Mm-hmm. And calls come in from all walks of life. I get calls from, professional people, from pilots, from police officers who are encountering all kinds of things, and they want no publicity, which I completely understand, so I don't use their names. But that's what's going on. But there's been nothing like that massive wave of 73. And over the years, we do sometimes have certain waves of activity. Every year, it's not 2 or 3 reports. We get multitudes of reports every year. Even the last few years during the pandemic, reports have just been continuous, which I'm really surprised. And, but anyhow, these things are ongoing. People are seeing things all the time, all year round. And, it's a fascinating phenomenon, whatever we're dealing with.
Yeah, whatever we're dealing with. I hope we kind of never know, because I feel like if we find out, like and the mystique is gone, it will be less fun. Do you agree with that?
Well, there's so many different anomalies we're dealing with. And the more I know about the phenomena, it's much more complicated and I don't think anybody understands the full phenomena. I don't think anybody knows the answers for sure. I don't think our government even does. I think they're very much aware of at least the UFO phenomena. I think they've known for years a lot more than telling the public. I've seen indication the government's had an interest in Bigfoot for quite a while as well. And I'm finding more and more data that suggests that some of these anomalies are somehow all related. And we're not saying extraterrestrial, but a lot of the cases I've been dealing with suggest we're dealing with a phenomena that has a physical and a non-physical component to it. And for lack of a better term, I think we're dealing with something that's interdimensional.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've talked about this recently on another episode of the show, which may or may not be cut out. I'm not sure, but I'll relay it again. A few weeks ago, a friend of mine and I went to a local cemetery. It's very rural. I'm not a ghost hunter type of person. Not that it's not fascinating to me, but I'm more interested in, UFOs, Bigfoot, cryptids, all of the other stuff. It's more fascinating to me. This Civil War cemetery that's local here is also really nearby a Bigfoot hotspot, and there are reports of free-floating illuminated orbs of light. So I was very interested in going to a place where there's potential for multiple kinds of activity. Immediately when we got there, we were hearing big crashes out in the woods, which was about probably 100 yards or so away. We were about 150 yards from a river, and it was between us and the river. So we don't know for sure what the big crashes were. I mean, there was no wind and it hasn't rained, but trees fall all the time. And then we were hearing like a breathing sound coming from the west of us at the edge of the woods. We couldn't see anything. Then I saw one of these lights. It was like an orange light. I thought somebody had a really cheap flashlight over by my car, and we got over there and there was no sign of anybody being there. We came back and the activity had quieted down. I thought, well, we're here in this cemetery where there's a lot of, Civil War graves. I'll play some music, from Civil War stuff. So we played Hell on the Wabash on my phone. And as I'm playing it, I look up in the sky and there's a light in the sky moving faster than any airplane that I've ever seen. And I pulled up the air traffic app on my phone just to see if it was picking up any, airplanes in the area. The closest one to us was about 45 miles away to the northwest, and it was heading southeast. This light was moving directly north. As I'm watching it on my phone to see if there's anything on there, my friend said, "Oh, it's flashing." He said, "Oh, never mind, it's gone." So like in a period of like 20 seconds, this thing showed up and was gone. So this one night we had, potentially Bigfoot activity, floating orbs of light, and a UFO in a supposedly haunted cemetery. So I totally agree that I think we're looking at facets of either the same thing or multiple things that interact in a way that we don't understand.
And what you just said is what I deal with. One of the patterns I found years ago, which is still ongoing, and I find talking to other researchers around the country that they're finding similar type of things, that one, many close-range, low-level UFO sightings and many encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids commonly occur in the vicinity of high-energy sources. So you've got many sightings around high-tension power lines, power plants, gas wells, gas lines, radio towers, railroad tracks, bodies of water. It goes on and on and on. There's definitely some association between energy and the phenomena. The small spheres of light is something I've been dealing with for years and years, going back to the 1960s. I call them mini UFOs, and they're fascinating. And a lot of people don't even know about this. The real small ones are about an inch or two in diameter. They look like oversized fireflies. And again, what we're talking about with these mini UFOs, these things are not high in the sky. They're down towards the ground. Yeah. They're very low. They approach people very closely, sometimes solid metallic, but other times very bright, luminous sources of different colors. I've had cases of these things, again, come within feet of people. I've had reports of these things pacing vehicles. I've had them enter people's homes and cars through open windows and sometimes go right out through the body of the car or right through the wall of a house. There's one interesting story I remember from years ago from northern PA where a person thought it was in the kitchen one morning. One of these small spheres floated in through the open windows, floating around the kitchen. So she grabs her broom and starts striking it. And she said it broke into two identical little spheres. They floated around and went back out the window.
Wow.
And while generally spherical, there are some incidents where they're not always. One case I investigated a few years ago was down in the Mon Valley area, which there's been a lot of history. Now, these are the small communities about 30 miles outside of Pittsburgh along the Monongahela River. And there have been a lot of history of UFO sightings, Thunderbird reports, Bigfoot, all kind of weird phenomena down there, even weird things in the river that's been reported. But I'll tell you about the case. It was interesting. This occurred back in October 2017. It was early morning, and this man got up early to be a nice guy to warm his wife's car up. And he walks down the steps, so it's an all-illuminated driveway area. And he looks towards her car, and he sees something about 10 to 12 feet away from the right bumper. The lights are on. The area around the car was well illuminated. He said the object was about 2 feet tall and shaped like a haystack. And he said the object was translucent and shiny, milky white color. There were vertical ribs that seemed to be the superstructure like chrome straws that could be seen through the translucent structure. The object was silent, was like about 1 to 2 inches off the ground, and was motionless when he first saw it. He said whatever the object was, after several seconds, the man realized that he was only about 6 feet away from it, and suddenly it zoomed extremely fast across the driveway to the left side of the car that made a perfect right angle, turned along the driver's side of the car into the darkness and was not seen again.
Wow. I have never heard of anything quite like that.
No, that's another. And here's another one that's one of my research associates, Jim Brown. investigate up in Fayette County, which you'll probably hear me talk a lot about. And this was in November of 2019. And this was a report he received that a fellow was up near Masontown, and about 4:30 in the afternoon, and the fellow was on his way home. He comes across a rise in the road, and he sees this ball sitting on the roadway, blocking his passage. So he stops his car, trying to figure out what's this unusual looking sphere doing on the road. But he realized he has to get out and move it to be able to go down the road. So he opens his car door, and he slowly starts walking towards it. And all of a sudden, he said, it began to slowly fade away, and just in a few seconds fade away and vanish and disappeared.
Wow. That's fascinating. I definitely, I'm very envious of that you get to hear all these stories firsthand. What's it like for you? Like, I know you've been doing it for so long. It's just probably your natural way now. But if you stop and think about it, like, what does it mean to you that you are so involved with all these things, that people come to you with all these stories?
Well, it's amazing, and you just never know what the next phone call is going to be about. You always think you've got the strangest story, then sometimes later you get something that's even stranger. I mean, I have incidents here that are just unbelievable. And there's some stories, to be honest with you, there's some stories I've been involved with, cases in the recent months that are so unbelievably bizarre, I'm reluctant to even talk about them, but I think the people are telling it. And in some of the creature cases I've been working on in the last few years are just really amazing. And if we have time, we can talk about a few of those. But, you know, some of the typical cryptids I deal with, a lot of Bigfoot sightings, investigated hundreds of Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania, some which are very highly unusual, a lot of Thunderbird sightings over the years, Black Panther sightings, which are very strange. And I found some connection with Bigfoot, with the Black Panthers, and the similarity and some of the very strange aspects of the Bigfoot phenomena. And we have winged humanoids. We're having these pale, skinny, hairless humanoid creatures, which are very strange the last few years that people are seeing very close. And there's just all kind of floating entities. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we're dealing with. And it just gets stranger and stranger. But what you've got to realize is you've got so many credible people. I mean, I wish I could tell you the background of some of these people and their positions that they hold or have held. These people want no publicity. They have no reason to make up the stories. They're going to gain nothing from it. Mm-hmm. And all they want to know is, like, did anybody else ever see something like this in the same area, or has it ever been reported? And most of the time, they're really happy to realize that they're not the only ones. That other people have seen something very similar.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. I do want to get into the Thunderbird stuff, but I have one more thing, and you just brought it up before we get into it. I'd like to know, you mentioned the connections that you've found between Black Panthers and Bigfoot. I'd really be interested in that.
Well, again, and as you brought up about the one area where you were at, everybody's heard about the Skinwalk Ranch.
Sure.
And the cases I worked on back in 1973, which if we're going to talk about it, we should talk about 73. It's going to take a while because these are very detailed reports, but it's amazing stuff. People have heard about it. I wrote a whole book about it called Silent Invasion because it goes into great detail. So 1973, luckily I had my first research group set up, and we were lucky because we could respond to this. We had no idea what we were getting into. Believe me, January of 73 through the last day of the year, there were hundreds and hundreds of UFO sightings across Pennsylvania. And back in those days, there was a lot of small town newspapers. So a lot of the local and statewide newspapers and even national news began to pick up some of these reports. So we had many sightings of not just high altitude lights in the sky, but many reports of large objects again, hovering over highways, chasing vehicles. There were landing reports. It was just an amazing time just dealing with all these UFO reports. And then the summer of 1973 comes around. We have the largest Bigfoot outbreak that was ever documented. Now went on for weeks and months until 1974, in early 74. And a lot of these Bigfoot sightings, again, were in daylight. Many of them were extremely close range. We're not talking about something that's a half a mile away in the dark. Many of these were at close range where people were 5, 10, 15, 20 feet away from them. In some cases, there was more than one creature. My teams would be out there day and night investigating reports. So we would be on the scene sometimes within minutes to hours after this occurred. So there would be at times fresh physical evidence, or you could see the animal reactions where even the most vicious dogs wouldn't move or bark after they encountered one of these creatures. You saw the human response. It was just an amazing time. So we have all these Bigfoot sightings going on. But as the reports are coming in, and you got to remember, communication back then is not like it was today. So people most of the time would call by phone, the police departments and the news media, because that's who they would call. And some people knew about us, but quite often they were referring the cases to my group to investigate. As we're going out to some of these investigations where there's large footprints, strange large footprints with a big stride between them under different ground conditions, we began to see incidents. Suddenly, these tracks abruptly stop where there should have been more tracks, even later in snow. And that was very unusual. Like, that just didn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then other reports began to come in that were very strange, that people would tell us they would see a Bigfoot in a certain area in daylight, watch this thing standing, and suddenly it would vanish and disappear and reappear a short distance away. I had one report from a police officer out in Derry Township along the Chestnut Ridge, which was a very active area then and still is today, believe it or not. He said this man came in who looked very serious and very shook up, and he said, I have to tell you what happened to my wife and I. He said, we're riding down the road, just taking a nice ride down the road that afternoon, and we're riding down the highway, and suddenly this tall, hairy, Bigfoot-type creature walked up on the road right in front of us. He said, I slowed down, but he said, I couldn't stop in time, and I hit it. And he said, upon impact, the thing physically vanished and disappeared, but there was damage to his vehicle.
Wow.
So that was very strange. And then things got weirder and weirder over the weeks and months ahead. We began to see this pattern. We would have a UFO sighting in a certain area. Within minutes to hours or days later, you'd have a Bigfoot sighting or vice versa. And then it got even more unusual where we had those really well-documented cases of a UFO and Bigfoot seen together at the same time and place. And again, if you want, I go into some great detail because they're long stories, they're very detailed accounts. Just the real brief part of the story is probably the most amazing case. It's one that's been written up, I'm sure, all over the world. Occurred in Fayette County, October 25th of 73. And just very briefly, if you want me to tell you the whole story, I will, but there were 15 witnesses that observed a huge UFO about 100 feet or more in diameter that landed in the pasture on a farm. And at the same time, there are two Bigfoot creatures standing there. That's the very brief part of the story.
Yeah, I think I've actually either read or heard you talk about that story, and it is fascinating. The connection with the Black Panthers, though, where does that figure into this?
So you have certain areas. We're getting a lot of feedback. I don't know if you're hearing that or not, but anyhow,
yeah, you're okay.
This area along the Chestnut Ridge. The Chestnut Ridge is about a 100-mile long mountain range. It goes through southwest PA, so it goes through Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County, and extends down towards Preston County, West Virginia, about a few miles outside of Morgantown, West Virginia. During that 73 wave, Westmoreland, Fayette, and Indiana County were extremely active with reports. Westmoreland, Fayette continues to be very active with reports year after year. And there's other reports along the ridge in different places as well. That's one of those really odd areas. You can't say any one specific area, but a lot of areas along the ridge. However, there have been over the years, and there continue to be active other areas that are more focused on, that this phenomena, for whatever reason, seems to target certain geographical locations of certain properties. And this phenomena, sometimes there's a long history of it, and sometimes it just begins to become active, and this can go on for weeks, months, or years. So when this goes on, people in that area reporting the small balls of light, UFOs, screams and howls, strange footprints, Bigfoot sightings, cryptid accounts, paranormal phenomena, all kind of stuff's going on. And we've had that here, going back to at least 1980, 81, 82. There are other places we've heard about these things going on. There's two areas I can think of right now that have been active even through the last couple of years, here in Pennsylvania, where this type of thing is going on. For example, during that wave, 1981 and 82, between Westmoreland and Armstrong County, And I was told, I remember interviewing the people, and they said this all began after one afternoon prior to that, months prior before that, of an object that fell from the sky into a wooded area in an afternoon. And soon after that, things began to periodically happen. Then 81, 82, things really picked up again, to UFOs, to the balls of light, the unusual footprints. But they were also reporting an outbreak of Black Panther sightings in the area. So sometimes what I found is when you have one type of cryptid appear, you have another one. And there are cases where you have more than one cryptid together at the same time. Some of the Black Panther reports are very strange. And of course, when we think of Black Panthers, we think about black leopards, black jaguars they're not common in this part of the world. That's something you generally see in the zoo.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's very, very strange. But I have, one, pretty fascinating case that happened back, years ago. And this was back, 1983, if I recall. Up in a very mountainous area that shows the similarity between what I've had case with Bigfoot and this creature. This happened, early one morning around 1 o'clock in the morning. It was a cold morning, and this guy was coming home and it was overheating. So he pulls into his driveway, goes in the garage, and he gets a can of antifreeze. He comes out, he has the hood open, he's putting, antifreeze in his vehicle, and he hears this loud growl. And he turns around. About 25 feet away is this large black house cat that's just standing there and just growling at him. So he didn't really pay too much attention to it. He goes back and he's going back working on the car. A few seconds later, he hears a second growl, but this time the sound is much deeper, much louder. He turns around to look, and he's shocked because that large house cat has now physically grown about another foot in size. And wow. He reacts by throwing the empty antifreeze jug at the animal, which he hit, and it growled fiercely at him like it was going to attack him. Then the animal took 2 or 3 steps backwards and growled again as it moved up road up the street that was illuminated. The guy runs into his garage and grabs his pistol and comes back out, and he's watching this thing walking up the road. And he said, now this thing is physically grown to the size of what he would see in a zoo, like a full-size black panther with a long tail, solid black, but it has luminous, glowing yellow eyes that's staring at him, it's growling at him. He took a shot at it. He wasn't sure if he hit it. But while he's watching this thing, he said it suddenly physically vanished and disappeared in front of him.
Wow. The reason that's incredible. The reason that I asked about the Black Panther, my ears perked up a little bit because until like fairly recently, I was not aware of all of the Bigfoot sightings in this area, the area that I live. Growing up, you didn't ever hear people here talk about it. We're a very conservative type of people here, although I'm not. I'm pretty progressive myself, but the general population is very conservative. It's not something people want to be heard saying out loud that they had some sort of strange experience. And the one thing people did talk about were Black Panthers. The school that I graduated from, our mascot was a panther, and it's a very common thing to hear about Black Panther sightings. And now that I'm also hearing about Bigfoot sightings in the same areas, that really got my curiosity when you mentioned that you had found that same type of correlation.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But the reason I brought that up about this creature that materialized and then disappeared is because one of the most amazing cases with the Bigfoot, going back to the 73, 74 outbreak, it had similarities. And this was the case that convinced me, among others, that Bigfoot is much stranger than an unknown animal. There's a physical and a non-physical component to it. This goes back again to that wave in 73, 74. This is February 6, 1974, way up in the mountains, near Ohiopyle. Some of your listeners will probably remember this time period. And there was a big national trucker strike. There was gas rationing across the country, so people remember that. There was some violence across a lot of the highways in the country. Here in Pennsylvania, the state police and National Guard were patrolling together. So you had some fellows from both units that went up to the scene that night. I was not able to get in at locally, so I couldn't get up there early morning. But anyhow, what I found out was when I got up there and interviewed the witnesses with my team, that this woman who lived in the mountains all her life. She was deep in the mountains in this little cabin home, and she was sitting there watching TV when she hears this noise on her little front porch. She had a number of empty pop cans out there, and someone was knocking the pop cans around. Well, her first thought was that a few weeks before, there was a pack of wild dogs. They're probably back, and they're probably causing this to happen. So she thought, you know what, I'll grab my shotgun, and I'll just shoot over their head and scare those dogs away. So she goes over, she grabs her 16-gauge double-barrel shotgun, loads one chamber. She makes her way up to the front of the house, front door, and she opens the door, turns on the switch, turns on the front light, and steps out. And there's no dogs there, but standing right there about 6 feet away is this at least 7 foot tall, hair-covered, kind of grayish, hair-covered creature. And it put his arm straight up over his head as soon as she put the light on. How does she react? She fires right into it with her shotgun. She said there's this bright flash of light, this big burst of light, like a flash on a camera, and the creature vanished and disappeared right in front of her.
Wow.
Now, her in-laws lived 100 feet away, and they heard the shot, and they called her on the phone. She tried to explain to them what happened. So her son-in-law grabbed his sidearm, his pistol, and starts walking up the road, and he saw a dark figure running down the road ahead of him. He couldn't make it out. But as he got closer, he said he was surrounded by 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire. Started shooting at them, ran to the house, and about the same time, there's this large object with lights on like a big Christmas ornament hovering over the trees at the same time. That's when they called the state police.
Oh, my goodness.
And by the time those officers found the property up there, I talked to the primary investigator, and he said by the time they got up there, everything was gone. However, he said something strange had happened up there. That he based on the animal reactions, which I have seen. And I always said, you can fool people, but you can't fool the animals. And when he got up there, everything was silent. They had a number of very large, pretty ferocious dogs. They had other animals at the farm. Nothing. The dogs wouldn't bark. They wouldn't move. And that's very common with many of these Bigfoot cases I've investigated. Even the most ferocious dog, when these things are nearby, these dogs, they don't bark. They shake. They cower, hide. Sometimes they won't eat right for days later. That's very, very common. And the troopers told me, remember, there was one big dog. I can't remember if it was an Eskimo Spitz or German Shepherd. It was in a cage. It wouldn't move. It wouldn't bark. He opened the cage, and he tried to pull the dog out, and the dog wouldn't even move. And the next morning when I got up there, all the dogs were barking again. Everything was back to normal. So that was the case, among others, which indicated we're dealing with something that's both physical and non-physical.
Yeah, absolutely. The non-physical and physical aspects of all these things. I've often wondered if UFO abduction cases were actually more non-physical than physical. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you this. I was involved. I was probably one of the first in the country to start investigating abduction reports back in the 60s. I am no expert in it because we had so many other kind of cases. And it was ongoing all the time. You just didn't have time or capabilities to do everything you wanted to do. There was so much going on. And we had, of course, it was out of our own time and pockets. And we're all working full time and had families, so you can only do what you could do. Mm-hmm. But I interviewed, some of my teams interviewed a lot of people over the years that claimed these type of experiences. And I believe some of these people were very sincere. A lot of them were professionals. They were just, there was not that something had happened to them that was interrupting their normal lives. For me to say that they were abducted by extraterrestrials, I can't say that, but something was going on. But here's something I've also found, and this is something that's pretty interesting. Of the many people I've interviewed have seen Bigfoot and other cryptids and UFOs, it could be just a normal general person riding down and being in the right place at the right time and have an encounter. But also, you find cases where some people have had a long history of having encounters throughout their lives with the paranormal, with cryptids, with UFOs. And many of these started when they were very young children who were having paranormal experiences or missing time. And then throughout their lives, they had these experiences. And in one case, I've been involved with this person for years. I've been in touch with. And this person, later her husband had encounters, then her children, now her grandchildren are having encounters. I've heard this from other people as well, so it could be hereditary, that there's something going on generation to generation. But a lot of it seemed to start when these people were very, very young, and in some cases it was missing time experiences.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've heard several reports, too, of it somewhat being hereditary. I interviewed Bill Konkoleski in the last season of my show. He's the MUFON director of Michigan. He has also had several experiences. He's written a few books about them, where his case is that he has 4 brothers. 2 brothers have also had very similar experiences, and the other 2 brothers haven't had any at all. It's fascinating how it just seems to pick and choose. It's like a tornado where it could, wipe out one house and leave the neighbor's house completely unscathed.
Yeah, it's just a really amazing. I said years ago, the phenomenon is so strange it protects itself. Because in most cases, if you don't have the experience yourself, it's hard for many people to believe and accept. But there are so many people out there. This is not a rare experience with these sightings. I mean, these incidents are going on all year round. I mean, I hear a lot of reports. I know other groups, other investigators, they're all getting reports. And before the pandemic hit, and I was doing a lot of lectures in a lot of places, everywhere I went, people were coming up to me and sharing incidents they've been involved with, and 99% of them have never made a report. So we have no idea how much of this is really going on that we don't know about.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have to change gears because I really want to get into hearing some Thunderbird stories, and I think you're the man to tell those.
I put them under the title Thunderbird. So we have these reports of these huge flying creatures, and your typical Thunderbird report that I've been involved with generally involves a large flying, an oversized turkey vulture, pretty much, but with a much bigger wingspan, stand much taller than a turkey vulture. So that's one type of report. Then you've got the other reports of people seeing a featherless, leathery skin, almost a huge bat-like creature, generally dark or generally black in color. We've had those kind of reports. I've interviewed very credible people who reluctantly tell me that they swear what they saw looked prehistoric, like a pterodactyl, pterodorn. And some of these are very, very detailed, very close accounts. And then we have the winged humanoid reports as well. So those are all interesting, and they go on quite often. In the last couple of years, we're seeing more reports, including last year and including the last week. I started investigating the reports back in the 60s. I started hearing about them back in the 60s. Of one place, of all places, is only a few miles from where I live in South Greensburg on the busy highway, Route 119, where there's been a history of such sightings. And it was the case. There's been sightings pretty much ever since 2001 down that area. And where people reported these huge flying whatever falling very low right over top of the truck and car traffic down in that area. And so there have been a lot of reports. A fascinating report that I remember, I interviewed a guy in neighboring West Virginia from, I believe it was the fall of 2007. It was on a 2-lane road, early morning. He's riding down the road and you have to hit his brakes very hard. Here's this huge creature standing there, blocking the road, eating roadkill. And it's only a 2-lane road, and the thing is so big, it's like hopping from one leg to the other, trying to get off the ground, flapping its wings, and it's looking right at the guy in the car, and he's looking at it. Finally, it gets up and off the air, but as it's flapping its wings, he's seeing dust and gravel and dirt coming up from both sides of the wingtips on the road. So the next day, he comes back and measures the width of the road. It was 21 feet across.
Wow. You mentioned that he saw the wings actually flapping. I've read reports of that, and I've read reports that the wings just seem to be for show, and that these things can just sort of move through the air without moving their bodies whatsoever.
And that's very common because some of the reports we're getting in recent years and recent months, they're just soaring through the sky. The wings are open, they're not flapping at all. Or in some cases, they do both. But if you go to my website, stangordon.info, your listeners can look at a lot of interesting reports on there. Well, and I can tell you about some of the ones from up in this area, too, in recent weeks. But this case is really interesting, and I'll explain even why in a minute. But I got this report May 26th, but it happened this past April. And this is down in eastern Pennsylvania. This woman was her appointment. So she's in the parking lot waiting for her appointment. She's talking to her friend on the cell phone, and suddenly she said something flew over a vehicle that shadowed the entire car, and she ducked her head thinking it was a small plane going down on top of her. And she commented to her friend about what happened. And moments later, she said she saw the biggest bird she had ever seen in front of her. She told her friend that the bird was unimaginable. And she said the bird never flapped its wings. It just soared toward the office where she was going for her appointment. And it looked like it was going to land on the roof. So she told her friend she was going to get out and try to get a picture of this thing. And she exited the vehicle and began to walk towards the back of the building where she thought it probably landed. And she looks up and this huge flying creature is perched on the highest part of the chimney. And she looks up for a moment. And at the same time, that giant bird looks down at her and makes eye contact with her. And it has, she said, it has piercing, fiery eyes. She says the eyes were large and round, even from the distance to the roof. They were vivid and green, red, and orange in color. And she said the size of this thing was immense. That when it looked down at her and made the direct eye contact, she knew she was in trouble. She immediately turned and ran in panic and disbelief. And as she turned the corner, she looked back for a second, and that huge creature was gliding toward her at an angle. It was only about 8 feet behind her, and its talons were out. She made her way to the office, and she just pushed in and just ran into the building and started screaming. So that was fascinating. But now, about a month or so ago, now that was in Eastern PA, about a month or so ago, I got another report from a person who knew nothing about this. This was up in western Pennsylvania, and this happened also in the afternoon and daylight. This very huge giant bird glided down within 10 feet of the witness, and the same thing, it turned its head and made direct eye contact with that person. So you have two similar cases, and it's very unusual.
Yeah, that's really unusual and terrifying at the same time. I don't know. I think there's something about the idea of a giant bird that it affects me more than, say, a Bigfoot or, an alien or anything of that nature, because it's something that we have knowledge of birds. You know what I mean? It's a familiar thing, but this is a different version of something that we know exists. And I think there's something about a giant bird that really just hits you hard,
Oh, yeah. And again, to the witnesses I've talked to, their lives were changed. They were horrified. And then what even was more frightening to them is they talked to people that they trusted, and they just wouldn't believe what they saw. People, I have no doubt they saw what they saw, is very similar to many other reports I've heard. And it's the same with people who run into Bigfoot and other cryptids. They might tell a few people close to them, but they have people are, sometimes they laugh at them, they ridicule them and tell them they're seeing things, they're hallucinating, and they knew what they saw. I've interviewed many experienced hunters, even the last several years, guys who've seen these things at close range, have been out in the woods for years and years and never saw a thing until that one day, and their lives were changed. And some of these guys told me they love the woods, so they'd never go back in the woods again.
Yeah, wow. What would you say is this is Hair Raising Horror Week for my show, so what would you say the scariest Thunderbird sighting that you've either done a report or read a report on would be?
Well, I think what I just read to you is really interesting because
that's good.
We have very few reports where these things come down that close to people. We've had them on the road, blocking roadways, that type of thing, and many reports in the sky. But those two reports are very, very interesting. It's interesting because they were only months apart, but from two different parts of the state, and there's no way that people knew about the other reports.
Yeah. I live on the eastern side of Illinois, and just across the Wabash River, central Indiana, there's a little tiny village called Miram. Miram sits atop this giant bluff, and on the side of this bluff, there is an old ancient painting of a thunderbird. Have you heard, you're in Pennsylvania, but have you heard many stories from this area?
Oh, yeah. Well, historically, of course, there's some case from Illinois and other states as well, but I know you have some famous cases going back to the 70s back in that part of the country.
Mm-hmm. Could you tell the story? I believe it was in Alton or it was Western Illinois anyway, of the child that was picked up and carried by one of these things.
Yeah, and again, I recall that. I'd have to look up the details. It's been so long. It's from memory from years and years ago. I remember it happening. I believe he picked it off the ground and he dropped the boy down. Yeah, and that's the only case I've ever heard of where something like that was claimed to have happened. I've had many cases where people had this giant bird so close to them that it could pick them up. I remember a case we had on a busy highway here outside of Pittsburgh in the afternoon of 2008. I understand another researcher, again, Jim Brown up in Fayette, investigated it, and people were apparently pulling off the road because this huge, giant, and if I remember, that was one of the reports where it was more like a giant bat. It was featherless. I believe that's the one. And it came down to within 20 feet of the cars, and people were getting out of the cars looking at this thing. And one guy apparently even had a camera, was taking pictures, but whoever he was, he never came forward. But one guy he interviewed, he was afraid this thing could pick somebody up. It was so huge.
Wow. We talked earlier about the connection or the, seeming connection between Bigfoot and UFO. Do you get many connections between Thunderbirds and other types of phenomena present day?
Only that again, you can have random Bigfoot sightings almost anywhere, but in some of the areas where you've got a history of repeating phenomena, you get Thunderbird reports. So we get Thunderbird sightings up along the Chestnut Ridge, for example. And the area here in South Greensburg, which is a fairly well-populated area, I mean, there's not a lot of woods around. There's some, but for miles around there for years, we've had Bigfoot sightings and UFO sightings. We had a report of a UFO in the last couple of days in that area that we're looking into. Very low, supposedly. So, I mean, there's so much we don't understand. And there's sightings of these things in more populated areas. In more recent years, you're getting cryptid reports in more populated areas and larger areas where there's more people around. And the same thing with the Thunderbird. We had a sighting in a suburb of Pittsburgh, I think it was about a year ago. These things are appearing, and I remember also talking about the stranger part of the Thunderbird stories. And again, I don't have the answers to what's going on. I don't think anybody does, as I mentioned earlier.
Right.
The whole point of this, you have all these weird creatures. We didn't even talk about some of the things we looked into.
Sure.
And you just cannot possibly have so many type of unknown creatures out there. It's impossible. At the same time, you've got so many credible people from not only Pennsylvania, from around the country and around the world reporting something similar. You can't just throw them out and ignore the reports. They're seeing something. There's a pattern to it. There's similar details. The only thing that makes sense to me is that, again, we don't understand it, but I think we're doing something that comes in and out of our physical reality. It can leave evidence of time. They come and they go. They're here and they're gone. And in some cases, people have seen these things that physically appeared out of nowhere. They see them for a short time and they're gone. And it's just really weird stuff.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you've had some reports come in within the last couple of weeks. Can you share some of that with us?
Yeah, we've had a lot of UFO activity in the last week. As recent as this evening, I had a report. A lot of the reports are in daylight or early evening, not all at night. Mainly cigar-shaped objects. So elliptical, elongated, cigar-shaped objects, which we've had reports for years. And also reports of kind of triangular and V-shaped objects being reported. That's been going on quite a bit. And then we did have a Thunderbird sighting, which was reported, I believe it was this past Monday morning. The witness, again, in this case, is very, very credible. I know what his background is and what he does. It was just getting light out in the area. This is here in Westmoreland County. And it was at a gas pump pumping gas when he happened to look up in the sky across the road, and he said, here's this huge bird that's flying very low over top of the tree trunks across the road. And he says to me, he said, it was like watching Jurassic Park over the trees.
Wow.
He said this thing was huge, and he knows turkey vultures. He knows the blue herons in the area. He said it was just getting laid out. He said it was all dark in color, so he assumes it was black. It had very long legs and a tail and had a very wide wingspan. And he said it occasionally flapped its wings, but often it just soared, and he watched as it went down the road. Then the next day, when nobody knew about this report, I got another report from, I'm going to guess 15, 20 miles away in the afternoon, where a person was sitting at a restaurant looking out the window with a friend who didn't respond to a question she was asked, turned around and said, I just saw this really big, dark bird, and described seeing this very, very big bird only for a few seconds going low across the sky. So we may have had two reports last week.
Wow. The Thunderbird thing, for me here, we have the historical significance in Illinois, which we kind of alluded to earlier. This is not one of the things that you ever hear a single person talk about here. So I'm always fascinated when I hear about these things happening in present day. I wish they were here. Maybe I just need to move to Pennsylvania. I don't know. The Thunderbird it's just one of those things I've always been fascinated with, just because, like I said, we have that history here and we never get to hear about it in my area. So I have to spread my wings and fly around on the internet now and find out these stories. So it's great that you have them coming in, present time. And I appreciate you sharing those stories with me.
In the last several years, I've heard a few more reports of these huge birds that people swear are white. And I had another researcher probably 2 or 3 years ago tell me that he interviewed a witness who swore they saw this huge giant up on the ridge, up near the Chestnut Ridge area. And it was a huge, I think he said it looked like a huge, gigantic hawk, but it was white. They told him also what was even stranger was it was transparent and they could see through it.
Wow, that's fascinating because occasionally you also hear of a white, Bigfoot, and of course, like the Yeti is, the abominable snowman is always white. Yeah, I've never heard of white Thunderbirds.
And nor had I until more recent years. So that's interesting. And you talk about the Bigfoot, the white Bigfoot. Well, here's one of the fascinating accounts from the 73 outbreak north of Pittsburgh. That evening, there were 2 women waiting for a friend to pick them up. They see this 7-8 foot tall, hairy Bigfoot with white hair, which is rare, but we get those reports, running across the road towards the woods. Even more interesting, it was carrying a small glowing ball of light. And a few minutes later, as it ran into the woods, this object came across the sky, projected a beam of light down into the woods where the creature ran into.
Wow, that is fascinating. I love those stories. Yeah. Here, there's a Bigfoot report on the BFRO website that's documented. And I know the son of the woman who sent the report in. And there is a sighting of a half black, half white Bigfoot. And I'm not sure if it's like a horizontal cutoff, like the legs are black and the top is white. It doesn't really go into it. It just says half and half. Have you seen multi-color patterns like that?
Not really like that. I don't recall any like that. I recall somewhere there's sometimes patches of different colored hair. And also we've had a few reports of what people describe as these creatures look older or sickly, where they had patches of hair missing and look like they may have had mange.
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon to, if these are humanoid type creatures, or even I think gorillas can, lose their hair as they age, or their hair becomes white, just like us. It's a physical aspect of it that definitely correlations with what we know about biology versus whatever in the heck these things are. You would expect, I guess, is what I'm driving at. You would expect an older creature to be, sickly or slow and to have, white hair or be bald. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah. And so again, that's fascinating. So we have reports. I mean, generalities of reports are 6 to 9 feet tall in this area. We've had a few cases over the years, which is hard for me to believe, but I was out there interviewing the witnesses and I saw what they showed me were these things. There were some around 12 feet tall. So what is something 12 tall hide and what does it eat to sustain itself? That's another part of the mystery.
Yeah.
And then you got smaller. They're about 4 to 5 feet tall, which we get reports of smaller ones as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you get very many reports about like an adult and child?
Not that often. I mean, over many, many years, we had some reports. I know during the 73 outbreak, we had some reports of large one and a couple smaller ones being seen together. It's very, very rare when you hear those kind of reports. We've had reports of more than one full-size, very large Bigfoot being seen together.
Yeah, it's fascinating. All of this is fascinating. I want to give you a few minutes here to promote. I know you've authored several books. You maintain a website. Where can people find information on you?
The website is stangordon.info, I-N-F-O. All my contact information is on there. They can reach me and talk to me directly, or they can email me. The best email is PAUFO@comcast.net. My books, I have written 3 books, and I have another one that hopefully will be out in the next month or so. It's going to have some very bizarre cryptids and things in there. They're so unbelievable. And things that people have never heard of before. I can almost guarantee that. Also, the books are available on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. So we mentioned briefly some of those cases with UFOs and Bigfoot, some very weird things, and they're in great detail in my book. It's Solid Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Case Book. My first book is Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, which covers cryptids and UFO cases where people are physically very close. So you've got Thunderbirds, Black Panthers, Bigfoot, other creatures, UFO cases. And then the most recent book is called Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures. which has some amazing cryptid and UFO stories in it. So they're all different reports.
What's the title of the newest book that's due to come out here soon?
We're still in the final stages, so I'm not going to say yet, but it'll be an interesting type. It'll be kind of eye-catching.
Okay. So stick around, stay tuned to his website so you can find out about this new one. He's being mysterious, folks. You gotta keep some things close to the chest, though. I get it.
Well, we just want to make sure everything's set the way we want to, and make sure we decide on the proper title. So we're still at the last minute going to finish that up.
That sounds great. I can't wait. I'll make sure to put links to your website in the show notes so that people can easily find you and check you out. And maybe they have some stories to send in to you. So maybe they can make the next book.
So thanks, Jason, for having me on the program. It was a fun evening.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully we can have you on again in the future and we can dig into some more of this crazy stuff because I know there's, like you said, there's hours of conversation to be had.
I'm sure we'll do it again.
All right. Thank you so much. You guys have been listening to Hair Raising Horror Week. This is Stan Gordon. Check out all of his information in the show notes, and we'll see you on the next one.
Until next time, keep the fire going.